Hello, welcome to Podsongs. I'm Jack Stafford, and I interview inspiring people in service to others as inspiration for a new song. Today, I'm speaking with a cult underground figure, author, journalist, and activist pushing for liberalizing copyright laws, and a proponent of the Creative Commons organization. Mostly he writes fiction books about digital rights management, file sharing, post-scarcity economics. Now, they don't sound like sexy subjects, but he has a huge following among teens and adults alike. His first big hit was Little Brother, about surveillance systems, and the Department of Homeland Security's attacks on the Bill of Rights. Now, that book is actually used as training material for new NSA recruits to give them a different point of view. I bet that's something he never predicted when he wrote it. So let's step into the future with Cory Doctorow. Getting an education from all my podcast guests as I go through, as it is whenever you run a podcast. And can I describe you as a futurist? Is that a good?
Oh, please don't. People who claim to know the future are either kidding themselves or you. And science fiction writers doubly so. There's nothing sadder than someone who thinks that because they make up futuristic parables, they're Nostradamus. So yes, no, please don't call me a futurist.
I saw one quote about you. Cory Doctorow doesn't just write about the future. I think he lives there.
Yeah, that was Kelly Link being very, very kind many years ago. But, hyperbole aside, I am someone who uses the device of futuristic parables to commentate on the present day. And of course, the present is the standing wave that is becoming the future. Mm-hmm. So things that you write about the present have enormous bearing on the future, to say nothing of the fact that the things that you write about the future might change how people approach the future as it arrives and actually have a direct impact on it. That's far more interesting than being a fortune teller, to be someone who can actually change the future as opposed to predicting it, which is, ultimately this very fatalistic idea, right? This idea that like the future is going to arrive no matter what we do, mm-hmm. basically says that human beings are just sort of, we're like grains of sand in an hourglass that is tipped this way and that by the great forces of history, as opposed to like actors on the world stage whose actions change the way that history plays out. So yeah, I'm far more interested in being an activist than a futurist.
But your work does influence the future, because I know a lot of people have read Little Brother and they say that it influences their thinking and opens their eyes to many things. So yeah, you definitely are.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that's true. Certainly, Little Brother and the other novels in the series have resulted in lots of people who work in the industry coming to me and saying, I was just approaching the field as a job or as a fascination, or I never even thought of getting into the field. But when I read Little Brother, I became alive to both the possibilities of technology to liberate us and the risks of technology in service of oppressing us, and decided which of those things I was going to put my thumb on the scales for, and embarked on a career as a technologist, as a cyber lawyer, a human rights activist. There are all kinds of people from different areas of the field who attribute their entry into the field to me. That is an enormous honor. I mean, frankly, like making up pretend stories to help people pass the long slog from the cradle to the grave is, it's a living, but like it's very little compared to actually having changed the way people think about and approach really important issues in the world. That's a far greater reward than knowing that you help someone drop off to sleep one sleepless night.
So I don't claim, I'm calling you for an education, because I can't claim to know anything about this or about the dangers, but I write a song about every interview. So mm-hmm. I'd like to, what is the most important issue to write, because with your work covers such a wide area. If I was going to write a song, if we can narrow it down, please, what would it be?
Well, I think that there is, that what I try to do is break through a false binary, a false dichotomy between the idea of technology as oppressor and technology as liberator, and move into a better, more nuanced view of technology as something that could be harnessed by us or that could be harnessed against us. That, it will all be great if we don't screw it up. And, subsidiary to that are things like, the idea that of technological self-determination and of pluralism, right? So like, it doesn't matter if you can make a free choice if there's nothing to choose from. So we need pluralism. We need lots of different centers of technological control. And then you need the freedom to choose among them as a necessary but insufficient precursor to a better future. I mean, people still might make unwise choices. We will have lots of work to do. If you imagine the world rearrayed, at the click of your fingers, such that instead of there being a couple of hegemonic social media services or search engines, whatever, there are hundreds of them, we would still have lots of work to do to help people make wise choices. But that is better work to do than to ensure that people have choices at all, right? If they don't have choices at all, then we're stuffed.
And we are stuck now with the monopolies.
We certainly are, yeah.
Okay. So do you think that's the theme in your work, these monopolies who've lifted up the ladder?
I would say that it's not monopolies per se. It's monopolies' effect on pluralism and self-determination. That we know how the monopolies arose. There are a lot of exotic theories about tech monopolism that lean on things like network effects or first mover advantage, but they're not really well supported in the evidence. I think that the preponderance of evidence is that the reason we have monopolies is we stopped enforcing anti-monopoly law. And that's why we've got monopolies, not just in tech, where, we can talk about first mover advantage and network effects, but also in like beer, where there's no articulatable first mover advantage, right? There's a monopoly in athletic shoes, right? They do not have network effects. They've just got the ability to like buy up any nascent competitor, merge with any major competitor, create vertical monopolies where they can control retail channels and prevent new market entrants that refuse to be bought out or merged with. I mean, that's the actual mechanism of monopoly. And it's part of a wider project of increasing inequality. And if you want to pin down like kind of where I land on all of this, it's that the difference between the right and the left is that the left believes that some people, or the right believes that some people were born to rule, and that there are different mechanisms for selecting that person depending on what kind of right-winger you are. There are people who believe that you create a market, and the market will find those that are born to rule through a kind of invisible hand. And there's people who believe that you can figure out who's born to rule by like who manages to pull a sword out of a stone, right? And or the people who are anointed by God or whatever, right? This is how you can understand the right as a political philosophy, because after all, within the right, you have Christian dominionists, you have Hindu nationalists, you have neo-Nazis, you have hardcore finance libertarians, you have imperialists of all stripes, you have American imperialists, British imperialists, Chinese imperialists. So like, what do they all have in common? Well, what they all have in common is the belief that some people were born to be subjugated to others, and that the world is best when those who were born to rule make decisions for the rest of us. And the project of neoliberalism, the last 40 years, the kind of Thatcher, Reagan, Pinochet, Brian Mulroney, Helmut Kohl project has been to reconfigure the world so that the rulers can find their way to the top, so that we can realize kind of a Plato's republic. And so, the reason we dismantled anti-monopoly rules is because in the view of the right, they stood in the way of the market deciding who should control huge swaths of our lives. That the market would find these efficiencies in monopoly. They would look down upon it. It would look down upon us, and through some complex mechanism, bring someone to the fore who would own all the railroads because they were the best person at railroading, and someone else who would own all the aluminium, and someone else who would own all of the computer networks and whatever. And you smile at all the aluminium, but Mellon, who is the Secretary of the Treasury, the guy for whom Carnegie Mellon is named, during the Gilded Age, owned all the aluminum in the world, right? They called him the man who owned an element. he like would do things like inveigle the U.S. government into entering in trade agreements with Chile so that his company could get the franchise for all the Chilean aluminum. He owned Alcoa, right? It was the largest aluminum company in the world, and literally the majority of world's aluminum belonged to him. And so, the view of the neoliberal project is that really that like Mellon should have owned the aluminum, that he was he was imbued by his creator with the wisdom, skills, and proclivities to, correctly manage the world's supply of an element. And that we know that because the market reached down and put him atop a pyramid of tin cans, right? And so that made him the pharaoh of aluminium. And they view all efforts to create pluralism, to create a kind of level playing field, to create a system where we're recognized for our individual talents rather than, kind of being ranked in a pyramid, instead being arrayed in a web of people who have different suitabilities to different things, none of which is more important than the other, but all of which are necessary and good. The janitor at the high-tech firm who is a subcontractor wearing a tabard and a hairnet and earning $11 an hour is just as important as the engineer who gets free kombucha and massages on Wednesdays and $200,000 a year in stock grants, because without the janitor, the engineer would die of listeria, right? So, they're both important, and they exist in a web alongside of each other, not in a hierarchy with one on top of the other. And, the rise of monopolies is part of a wider project, which is the rise of modern aristocracies. And, the reason I care about technological self-determination is because I think it's an anti-oligarchic force, that the thing that computers and networks do, in addition to all the other things they do, like entertaining us and computing things for us, is they allow us to communicate with one another to make common cause and agitate for change. And that is the necessary, insufficient precondition for solving the climate emergency, for solving the oligarchy emergency, for, addressing all of our woes. We're not going to solve our problems by finding a wise king and asking them to decide how our world should be run. We're going to solve our problems through collective action that involves legitimacy and collective buy-in. I mean, you can see what happens, for example, with contact tracing and exposure notification and distancing and mandates, where the people who bring them down are not viewed as trustworthy or honest brokers. Nobody abides by the rules, and they invent conspiratorial explanations for the rules. They say, the rules are there to soften you up for some killing blow that will take away all your freedom, and as a result, we sicken and die. And so there, even if you were a wise king who did know the right rules for all of us, if people didn't trust your rules, there's no amount of enforcement that will make those rules work, because they are not viewed as legitimate. You just can't tighten the net tight enough to keep the rules working. I mean, China's trying it in Xinjiang province. They put 1 million people in concentration camps. They practiced punitive rape and forced labor and torture, and they still haven't convinced Turkic Muslims and other members of religious ethnic minorities in the West to embrace, the party ideology. So, if that didn't work, right? If like totalizing pervasive surveillance with the unlimited application of state violence failed to stand in for legitimacy, then I think we've just got to go back to the drawing board on whether coercion is going to solve these problems, or whether we need to have this sense of shared destiny and the legitimacy that arises from it.
Okay, so you'd think technology would be one of the ways immune to this monopoly, because the smartest brains can think of other networks and things like that. I mean, you can understand how aluminum or things like that, because you need a lot of resources, you need a lot of investment. But how come? Because AT&T was broken up, and these other companies grew up, and now how have they pulled the ladder up? How has this happened?
Yeah. So you mentioned the AT&T breakup. There's a kind of little story about this, which is that in the 1979, I got my first computer, an Apple II Plus with a modem. And there were bulletin boards, and there were bulletin boards all around, including bulletin boards in the US. And by 1982, they had really proliferated. And one of the reasons they proliferated is that AT&T had been broken up. And so the breakup of AT&T cleared the way for all kinds of stuff involving modems and telecommunications that AT&T had been hostile to. The way to understand that is that AT&T was very committed to charging for each component of a telecom service. So, you may remember that there was a time when caller ID cost extra on your phone bill, right? So knowing who was ringing before you picked up the phone cost extra. And that's really like intrinsic to the like business model of the telecoms industry, that if you can think of a new thing to do, you should be able to charge money for it. Now compare that with email, right? Email is like a phone call. It's a message potentially from a stranger, potentially from a friend. And AT&T doesn't get to stick its nose in and say, to read the from line before you open the email is going to cost an extra $1 a month, right? The email comes with a from line and a subject line preview, even though that's clearly a thing that has value, right? If you think of two email systems, right? One that doesn't have see the from line in the subject before you open it, one that does. The second one's more valuable. And the AT&T theory goes, if there's value, someone should have the right to extract money for it. If value, then right. And so AT&T really didn't like modems because they correctly understood that once data was a service on top of a basic rate network, that network would become a commodity, that you couldn't upcharge for long distance or for messaging or for caller ID or for any of those other things. You may remember Minitel. There were versions of it in most countries where literally you got charged by the keystroke for using network services. And that was considered a like an efficient network, right? An efficient business, because it meant that the person who was providing value had the incentive to do it, and the more value you provided, the more money you got. And it sucked. And so you get online in the early 80s and you're in this world of BBSs that was only possible because of the AT&T breakup. And then in 1984, you got this huge cohort of friends on the network because they all went out and bought IBM PC clones. And the reason that they were able to get IBM PCs and IBM PC clones is that IBM, although it hadn't been broken up by the DOJ, spent 12 years in antitrust hell before the DOJ walked away from the fight. Every one of those years, IBM spent more on lawyers to fight that case than all of the DOJ lawyers working on all antitrust cases combined. And AT&T was humiliated and traumatized by the experience, or IBM rather. And when the experience was over, every time they were at a juncture where they could do something that would, increase a monopoly power and something that would be more pluralistic, they went for the latter, not because they'd had a change of heart, but because they were terrified of spending another 12 years, being tied to the bumper of the DOJ's truck, dragged up and down, a gravel road, right? And so when they needed an operating system for the PC, they were like, oh God, the DOJ hates it when one company makes both hardware and software. We'll get a couple of nerds named Paul Allen and Bill Gates to supply the operating system. And then when this queer punk hardware engineer who lives a couple of miles from me here in LA, Tom Jennings, was hired by Phoenix to reverse engineer the ROM on the PC, they didn't come after them. And so those ROMs went into Gateway, Dell, Compaq, and all those other PC clones, right? Because IBM just didn't want to get into it again with the DOJ's lawyers. And then, along came the DOJ again to punish Microsoft for abusing its monopoly. And although, again, Microsoft escaped without being broken up, they were traumatized in the same way that IBM was. So when a couple of guys named Larry and Sergey, left their Stanford lab and started a company called Google, rather than attacking them the way that they attacked Netscape, Microsoft just sort of put its hands up and step back and let Google grow. And so, that kind of anti-monopoly energy has been really important to maintaining dynamism in the field. But the thing is that it came at the end of the antitrust era. The antitrust era really starts in the New Deal after the Gilded Age, after the Depression, after the election of FDR, and it ends in the Thatcher and Reagan era. And so, the reason that AT&T was able to re-merge with all the companies that had been broken up from is not because of an intrinsic flaw in antitrust. It's because they just stopped enforcing antitrust. It was like the last thing they did. And, the Microsoft enforcement action, the reason it failed is not because Microsoft was innocent, but because their heart wasn't really in it. And what you have now are these companies that only exist because of the power of antitrust, of anti-monopoly enforcement, to clear a space in the canopy so that green shoots can sprout, now ensuring that no one ever cuts down their mighty tree trunks or trims the crown, because they've been allowed to grow through monopolistic tactics by merging with major competitors, with using predatory tactics to destroy new market entrants, buying up new market entrants in a predatory way, the way Zuckerberg did with Instagram and WhatsApp, specifically because they understood that users were choosing them rather than Facebook, and buying them so that users wouldn't have a choice. That even if they chose Instagram, they'd still be choosing Facebook, right? To eliminate that element of self-determination by eliminating pluralism. And the result of this has been that you have these highly concentrated industries. And a highly concentrated industry has two real advantages. The first is they have more profits. Right? Monopoly, the economists call them monopoly rents. When you don't have to compete, you can extract more profits because you don't have to worry about your competitors charging a lower price or offering a better price to your distributors or your suppliers. And so you can keep more of the money on your side of the balance sheet and keep it from, leaking out of the organization into other people in the value chain. This is why musicians are getting such a raw deal from like Spotify. Spotify will take in, for example, $80 million from UMG for the quarter as a guaranteed payment for the streams. Then UMG negotiates an extremely low per stream rate so that at the end of the quarter, the attributable revenue, the revenue that can be attributed to a specific musician, only comes out to $50 million. And $30 million of that guaranteed payment just goes straight to UMG's shareholders. And so, you see how having concentration within the industry allows the industry to squeeze its suppliers, which is, often labor, but also smaller firms, and to just, reduce their material circumstances to an untenable level, whereupon they just start to collapse or become absorbed into the larger firms as kind of low-waged employees or contractors. And so they have this excess rent that they get from being able to do dirty tricks. And then they have a small enough number of entities in the industry that they can agree on how to spend the excess rent to buy the policies that will preserve their monopoly. Solving collective action is the hardest problem that we have as a species. It's why we can't do anything about climate change and why we're struggling to deal with vaccines and so on. And as anyone who's ever tried to organize a dinner knows, figuring out what 5 people want to eat is a lot easier than figuring out what 50 people want to eat. And when an industry fits around a single dinner table, they can all figure out what they want to do. And we have seen the proliferation of policies that disadvantage new market entrants and also non-traditional market entrants, cooperatives, tinkerers, even quangos like quasi-state entities and so on, whether that's software patents or procurement rules or anti-circumvention rules or new things like Oracle is arguing that it should have a copyright over APIs in the Supreme Court. And all of these things shut down the tools that these companies themselves use to grow. They eliminate the possibility that that anyone will do unto them what they have done unto others. So it's just, it's pulling up the ladder behind you. And they offer the same justification that everyone who's ever pulled up the ladder behind them does. They say when we went up the ladder, that was the legitimate progress of society. That was, the people who had been anointed to rule finding their way to the top. When you chase us up the ladder, that is people who belong at the bottom of the pyramid, illegitimately trying to scale its heights, get back down to the bottom of the tin can pyramid. I own all the aluminium.
Yeah, Google And these guys don't seem very traumatized by the lawsuits, though. They've been involved in many.
Oh, well, wait. It's going to get ugly. They're going to get deposed, right? They're going to get put on the stand. I mean, it's interesting because like the big tech companies are split now between companies that have got like professional managers that aren't organized around cults of personality. Microsoft, Google, for sure, and a couple others are like that. Salesforce, I think. And then there are the ones that are still organized like cults of personality, like Microsoft was in the Gates era, which are like Facebook and Twitter, and other ones like that, Netflix, where you have these sort of outsized individuals who are synonymous for with their companies, right? And those people will be they're not managers who mismanaged a company. They are great villains of history who personally undertook action for their own firm. There's a kind of moral directness to the way that we talk about these founders. It's not fair, right? I think that it's every bit as true that the faceless professional managers that operate that run Google or Microsoft are as culpable as Zuckerberg is. But when Zuckerberg is on the stand, he is not on stand merely as the leader of Facebook. He's on stand as Zuckerberg. And that is not true if Sundar Pichai is on the stand. Tim Cook would be on the stand, I think, as the face of Apple. He's probably like the intermediate case. He's sort of betwixt and between. Larry Ellison would definitely be the face of Oracle.
So what does that mean then? You could see them split into different camps, or?
Oh, I think there will be some of that for sure. I think that Google has actually planned for that from the start. I think the reason that Alphabet exists, Alphabet is this like corporate structure they have, is to create suggested fracture lines for an antitrust breakup that are preferential to the company. Because it's like it would be a nonsensical fracture line to break the company up on, right? Like, it's what they've done through Alphabet is they've taken all the stupid vanity projects and made them look like they sit as co-equals with the projects that are genuinely monopolistic. And they've taken the projects that are genuinely monopolistic, and by not splitting them into multiple pieces, like search and ads, for example, by having search and ads under one umbrella, they create the kind of implicit assumption that they're indivisible. And so if you're an extremely naive regulator and you kind of look at the corporate structure of Google, of Alphabet, you're like, all right, well, clearly we can't let the division that makes irrelevant Wi-Fi balloons be connected to the vision that fails to make smart cities. We'll split those up, and that will be our anti-monopoly enforcement. But you never try to drive a chisel between the ads and the search, which is actually where all the anti-monopoly stuff is going on.
So they've thought ahead.
I think so, for sure. Yeah, no, and I think that it won't work, right? I think that when it comes, they're going to be really freaked out, and it's going to be traumatic, and there's going to be lots of memos that come out. There's a lot of people within those large companies that have not been served well by them, whether that's contractors or, we saw 20,000 Googlers walk out last year, a year before last, over sexual harassment and assault in the workplace, and the fact that they paid the Android founder $80 million to go away when it came out that he'd been sexually assaulting his juniors. So there are a lot of Googlers who, but for, the fact that the company seems so all powerful, would be speaking out, and they will. This is happening within Amazon, for example. Amazon's a good example of a company that's a cult of personality, right? That, when Jeff Bezos is on the stand, he's on the stand as Jeff Bezos, and he's on the stand as Amazon. And yeah, it will be personal for him. In a way that it wouldn't be necessarily for like Sundar Pichai.
So you're saying that this situation will come to an end because of regulation and not because of some grassroots revolution?
I think that it's iterative. I think that what you get is, there are these four forces that regulate our world: code, norms, markets, and law, right? What's like technologically possible, what's socially acceptable, what's profitable, and what's lawful. And they interact with each other. They feed back on one another. They're not really easily separatable. But, if something is immoral, it's harder to make it legal and easier to ban it. So there will be lots of moral discourse, right? Normative discourse about whether or not what big tech does is right or wrong, as opposed to legal or illegal. But that will feed into what's legal or illegal, right? That'll feed into regulation. Moreover, the regulation and moral sentiment will create the demand for tools and markets that those tools will enter. So you'll have technologists building stuff that we haven't seen technologists building in a long time. Like, no one's really taken a serious hack at building a search engine in like a decade, right? Yeah. Except for like Microsoft, right? Except for Bing. No one has shown up at like Kleiner Perkins or any of these other VCs and said, I'm going to make a search engine. It's just going to be a standalone search engine. It's not going to have like all the other stuff Google's got attached to it, but it'll be better than Google, have better search results than Google. I need $80 million, right? Nobody does that anymore. So there'll be lots of like things that people build that will prove that things can be done, that will prove the moral case that things should be done, that will create the market forces and the investment capital to do the things, that will create the regulation that puts pressure on these firms. I mean, one of the things that makes these firms so regulation proof is that they have achieved the trick of convincing us that they are inevitable. And so, right now, the bulk of regulation that we see proposed for these firms, and certainly what like they themselves advocate for when Zuckerberg talks about the need for a regulated space, what they want is regulation like the Magna Carta, right? Regulation that recognizes the divine right of kings, but asks the king to suffer himself to be draped with the golden chains of office by an aristocracy that will tell him what his duty to the nation is. And then he will, consider these imprecations from his aristocrats, and in his own divine judgment, decide which of those he will take on and which he won't. And that's Facebook's version of regulation, right? Not all regulation is created equal. And so I think that you'll get regulation that will be pro-pluralistic instead of regulation that will be about getting the buggers to behave, right? I think we will get regulation grounded in the idea of fixing the internet rather than regulation grounded in the idea of fixing the tech companies, because the tech companies can go fuck themselves, right? We've got to save the internet.
But I've heard you say we're in a turnkey era of surveillance and control. So
yeah,
would that also bring an end to that, or in no way at all?
Well, the thing about turnkey surveillance is that it rests on a kind of toxic dynamic where you have firms that over-collect and that are incentivized to design devices that you can't prevent from collecting data. And then you have states that loot the firm's repositories of our data at will and you treat them as a kind of off-the-books, low-cost adjunct to their surveillance capability, to their law enforcement and public safety capability. And as a result, they're incentivized not to do anything to rein in the surveillance excesses of the firms. And so we have to break this dynamic, right? We have to get rid of public surveillance, we have to get rid of private surveillance. To get rid of private surveillance, we have to get rid of public surveillance. And the people who pose this as two separate forces have a really gross misapprehension about how this stuff works. I sometimes go and speak in Silicon Valley about this stuff, and those people say, I don't mind if Google spies on me. All they want to do is show me better ads. I'd like better ads, right? But the NSA, well, those are the people who are too stupid to get jobs at Google. Who the hell knows what they're going to do with my data? I don't want them spying on me at all. And then I'll go to like West Point or some other, kind of Beltway or intelligence agency or whatever, and they will say like, look, I've got security clearance, and to get that, I had to tell Uncle Sam everything and expose all the intimate secrets of my life. I don't care if the government's spying on me. They already know everything. But, Google, Facebook, those, rapacious sons of Manon would sell their mother for a nickel. The last thing I want is them spying on me. And what neither of them appreciate is that the reason that tech companies are allowed to spy on you is that governments want to plunder their data. And so if you want tech companies to stop spying on you, you have to convince the government to stop spying on you. And if you want the government to stop spying on you, you have to ban tech companies from spying on you.
Okay. I've heard you say about DRMs, they're in everything, and they're a key problem as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is just more oligarchic stuff, right? DRM as a technology is moderately effective, generally doesn't survive contact with the real world for very long, tends to be, more of a nuisance than anything, but DRM in combination with a system of global laws like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, Article 6 of the European Copyright Directive, Canada's Bill C-11, I want to say, the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, Bill 92A in New Zealand, Hadopi in France, and so on. These rules all ban removing DRM or exposing its defects to public scrutiny, and or making tools to help people bypass it. And as a result, firms have realized that if they design their products such that using them in ways that benefit you and not the firm shareholders requires bypassing DRM, then doing things that displease shareholders becomes a felony, becomes a literal crime. So, any company that can conjure up a doctrine of felony contempt of business model will, right? There's just no way that they can pass on that temptation over the long term. And if they do, well, they will be outcompeted by a rival who figures out how to force you to arrange your affairs to their benefit. And so we see this metastasis of DRM, and it has lots of consequences, not merely that we are ripped off, although we are, right? That we have to, get our car fixed at the official mechanic. We have to get our phone fixed at the Genius Bar and so on. But also that these devices are designed in such a way that anyone who audits them and reveals their defects faces both criminal and civil liability, because revealing those defects might weaken the DRM. And so you have these unauditable attack surfaces for this ever widening constellation of devices that are ever more intimately bound up in our lives. The medical implants, the infrastructure systems in our houses and our vehicles and our workplaces, and everything in between, from the most personal to the most meta, your body in a computer in your body, all governed by DRM that is designed to treat you as its adversary, that is unlawful to audit and publish on, and that, as almost an incidental element, although this is the incitement to it, also treats you as like an ambulatory wallet to extract value from.
So even if you buy something and you're the legal owner of a toaster or a tractor or a telephone, and you can open it, you can be breaking the law.
Yeah, like your iPhone belongs to you, but jailbreaking it so that, or making a tool to help people jailbreak it so that they can install third-party apps of their choosing rather than the apps that Apple has blessed is a crime. It's a felony, and so finding when companies do that, what they do is they erode this idea of property itself. There's an old property law baseline from Blackstone on property, is 17th century treatise that everyone reads in their first year property law class. And he defines property as that which man enjoys sole and despotic dominion over to the exclusion of every other person in the universe, right? Well, like if your printer can figure out when you're putting third-party ink in and punish you by bricking itself, that is not property in the sense of sole and despotic dominion. Likewise, if your ventilator at the hospital is a Medtronic ventilator and it can tell that the person who swapped a monitor from a dead ventilator into one that had a broken screen wasn't working for Medtronics and didn't give them the $180 for the service call, then it can lock itself up and let the patient die, which is another thing that's happening during the pandemic. And so, this notion of property rights, which, is a complicated notion and not an unalloyed good, but pretty bedrock to the ideology, the pledged ideology of people who swear by corporations and their efficiency, those property rights are in retreat for all but corporations, right? For all but these like sort of transnational, transhuman colony organisms that see us as their inconvenient gut flora.
It's hard writing about the present, let alone writing about the future. I mean, we're in this kind of Marxist, capitalist, who knows where we are. I mean, we're not in...
Well, I think that Marx obviously didn't get the specifics here. He didn't anticipate the Internet of Things, but, Marxian theory gives you a lot of tools for unpacking what's going on. I mean, he kind of predicted a lot of this stuff. And it's stuff that other people later on, people who advocated markets as the right answer said, well, Marx got this right, but, and then went on to say, why they thought his conclusion was wrong.
I don't think I can write a song about this. I need to do it I need to go back to school to do this one. It's just I'm way over my head on this.
Well, it's something that we all got to figure out, right? We've had a lot of obfuscation in economics and politics and political economy, where there's been this like deliberate attempt to make the field as difficult to understand as possible. And things must be as simple as they can be and no simpler. But the movement of for example, antitrust and monopoly, from the idea that monopolies themselves are a bad idea to the idea that monopolies are only bad when they create consumer harm, is proven through these really difficult to follow economic equations, really took monopoly enforcement from a domain where we could figure out what we were, whether or not we had a monopoly problem, to one where we just have to trust the experts to tell us whether a monopoly is a problem. And that has not been great for us.
It's not the free market, is it? I mean, so you were doing your audio book by yourself for your last book.
Yeah, I just did. It's out. Yeah.
So how is that going? Because you wanted to sell it through, if you do it through Amazon, they have a DRM in there, and you said...
So so I said no, and I retailed it myself first as a Kickstarter, where I pre-sold copies, and now it's in all of the online audiobook sellers, with the exception of Apple and Amazon, who require DRM, and so it's doing pretty well. I mean, the initial sale, including some premium items and the ebook and so on, generated $270,000 gross, of which about $128,000 or $130,000, no, it was $150,000 went to me. After, and then my expenses on it were in the kind of $20,000 range. Amazing. So, about $110,000 before tax, and that's a really good sum of money, right? That exceeds the money that I would have expected to get over a really, protracted period with the book. And now the book is in its kind of second life, where it's being sold on the marketplaces that you can buy audiobooks on, and I'm making a pretty good clip at it. I think, this month, so this will be the first full month, or no, last month was the first full month after I closed out the Kickstarter. I probably made an extra, $3,000-$4,000 clear off of the book. And that's money that my agent doesn't get a piece of, my publisher doesn't get a piece of. That's just straight into my pocket. So, the normal royalty on audiobooks is about 20%. So to make $4,000, I would have had to have, through a publisher, done significantly more business than that. I would have had to have done, 5x that, $20,000 gross sales. And I just got this morning, I got another $1,000 from one retailer. So the retailers, every month they give you a check. So, it ranges from a couple $100 for the smaller ones to a couple $1,000 for the larger ones. And, every time there's a discussion of it, every time the book is in the public eye, I do a direct retail from my own website, where I keep 100% of the revenue. With the distributors, it's more like 40% or 50% in some cases. But with myself, it's 100% of the revenue. So the book is $25. I'll give a talk and I'll sell like 8 copies, and that's just like $200 that lands in my pocket for the day, which is certainly more than my outgoings in a day. So that has been really good. And it also one of the things that happened with the pre-sale of the book is that I also sold the ebooks on behalf of my publishers, and I get a royalty on that. I get the 30% that Amazon would normally trouser for the book. So that goes straight into my pocket. And then of the remaining 70%, 25% comes back to me in April as a royalty. And so, that $150,000 or whatever, that's the first tranche. And then of the $70,000 or $80,000 I remitted to publishers, about 25% of it comes back to me. It's actually higher than that because my UK deal is a 50-50 no advance split. So I'll get more money from them. So it generated a ton of revenue. It is probably not going to sell as well now that it's not an Audible, right? But the total sales volume of it will exceed what I would have gotten from Audible. And so that was the right way to go. And it certainly paved the way for the next one. And I will do this with the next one. My agent in the new year will be negotiating my next book deal. I'm nearly finished with my next novel. It's a book about, it's like a post-Green New Deal environmental utopian novel about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias. And he'll be negotiating that, and he'll be negotiating the audio package, and we'll be figuring out how to make the audio package work in such a way that it works for my publisher as well. And I could use their help, right? And so it'd be great. I would give them a share of that money if they would participate in the work and the promotion. If we could join that stuff up, which I think now that I've shown that I can, they will.
Gosh, yeah, because you started out with Creative Commons, you were giving your work away, and now you're seeing the fruits of that labor. So
I certainly think that's the case. And one of the ways where this is, and like I'm able to now with time get a little more granular. So one of the things that I've learned over time is that it's particularly good for English speakers who don't live in English speaking territories. They are at the greatest disadvantage to acquiring a commercial product. And for the most part, they represent an affluent elite of those countries, right? People who are fluent and preferential English readers in Germany are mostly not expats from the Anglosphere. They're mostly really well-educated Germans with good jobs who've got lots of disposable income. And I generate about 15% of my sales from what's called open territory, non-English speaking countries, people who want to buy English editions. And that's pretty cool, especially since the way that the publishing deals work, if I'm selling the ebook or the audiobook there, even if I have a deal with my publisher for that ebook or audiobook, I am, for the purposes of a sale outside of the Anglosphere, the publisher, and I get 100% of that revenue. So, that's about 10x of what I would get from a traditional publisher. And so with those German sales, if they're 10% of my sales, and it generates 10x the royalty, then it accounts for an effectively a doubling of my income by having those out of market sales. I don't know if that's replicable, right? I don't know if now that there's a greater availability of English language work in non-English speaking territory, you could break in and discover an audience in the way that I did. But certainly, it worked really well for me. It was definitely a good move for me.
That's so inspiring, for other writers. And I've taken up so much of your time. Maybe I could just finish up with one selfish question: what could I take away from that as a musician? Because as you said, Spotify is not giving us a great deal. I have to, I think, get a song played about 320 times to get $1. So,
right.
And there's all these independent musicians taking these Spotify training programs so we pay for adverts to send people to listen to our music on Spotify so that we can get paid nothing.
Wow. I mean, there are the reason I undertook all of this was not merely because I thought it was the best thing for me. It was to try and make the case for structural change. And I think that what you're rubbing up against here are the limits of individual action against structural problems, right? You can't recycle your way out of climate change. Like, even if you're really, really diligent about separating your waste, climate change has a structural problem, and will have a structural solution. And there are artists who have figured out how to make a go of it. The kind of using Spotify to drive Patreon patrons, et cetera, has been a well-trod path. And it works for a minority of artists in the same way that, it must be said, all ventures have worked for a minority of artists since the beginning of time. I mean, the fraction of musicians who picked up a guitar and dreamt of making a living at it as versus the ones who actually did it through all time, through all musicians, is like as close to zero as it's ever been, and will be until we have like fully funded arts programs. So, markets just don't provide the jobs that artists want. They don't provide the opportunities that artists want. What I would say is that, to the extent that you find yourself herded into someone else's platform, like Spotify, like Amazon, even if you're a writer and you find yourself herded into Audible, do it in the way that preserves your power to the extent that you can to leave the platform. So today, I write this daily newsletter and blog called Pluralistic, and it starts off as Twitter threads because that's where I have the most followers. But all of those Twitter threads point back to the newsletter and the blog. And the idea is to use Twitter as a funnel to bring fans to a site that I control, so at the end of every day's threads, I'm like, you can read this whole thing in a much more elegant form, easier to follow form, without any surveillance, because I don't have any tracking or anything, just by going here, and it's free, right? You don't have to have a login, you don't have to have a password, you just put in your RSS reader, or you sign up for the email, or you visit it on the web, put it in your bookmark tab group that you open every morning, however it is you consume news. And the idea here is that whatever happens in the future, however I figure out how to make money off of this, or turn it into something that matters to me for social change or for other reasons, that I will be, the extent to which I'm subject to the whims of people in a distant corporate boardroom is minimized. And treat every decision that requires you not just to use a platform, but to make yourself reliant on that platform with real gravity. Treat it as a serious potential downside, and be willing to take a little less upfront now in exchange for maintaining that autonomy, because the odds are that you will never succeed in the arts, right? That is the odds for every artist. But if you do, your ability to succeed, to turn that success into something that supports you, will be directly related to the extent that you maintain control over your own platform, over your own distribution, your own contact with your fans, your own editorial choices, and so on. So, by all means, do this podcast, but make sure you publish an RSS feed, and not just Bandcamp, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Put the RSS feed in the show description so that people who find it on Apple Podcasts can find the RSS, because you're never going to have as much Google juice as Apple will. So you use Apple's Google juice to direct people to non-Apple alternatives for subscribing to it. So that if Apple ever decides arbitrarily to remove you from the podcast feed, you will have migrated as many people as possible off of getting your podcast through Apple and onto getting it through a mechanism where you aren't subject to those whims, where you have some autonomy, self-determination.
Yes, because some podcasts have been edited and controlled, I try to use...
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, Apple has these ever-shifting rules, and they also, sometimes play games with search results where they downrank things and so on. But, just generically, it's never good to like... those companies, they just don't care about you. It's not that they're like necessarily actively trying to thwart you, but when they make a decision, if that decision harms you, that's not going to stay their hand if it helps them. It's a bit like, those Caribbean nations that adopt the US dollar as their currency, and just assume that US monetary policy will always work in their favor. And the US can and does and has taken decisions in its monetary policy that has been really, really bad for countries that use the US dollar as their de facto currency, not because it wanted to harm them, but just because it didn't care if they did.
Yeah. I ask everyone to. I send all my music. I put my music on these channels like you do with your I treat it like a Twitter or something. But then I try to get everyone to buy music on the website so that they go, because I think you need like 3 million streams a month to get minimum wage or something like that. It's like,
that sounds about right. I mean, I guess you need to ask yourself how many. What is the total number of radio listeners? Because that's what a stream is, right? You would have had to be exposed to your music before you could make a living, right? And it may be not much off from 3 million. I mean, that's the, like, it's the direct comparison is the wrong one. You know, it's like the comparison of listeners to, you know, records sold. It's more like listeners to radio plays. And, you know, if you're on a mid-sized market radio station, you know, if you're on Memphis radio or something here, even in the golden age, I don't know how many ears you would have to hear your music before you were earning minimum wage. My guess is it's a big number. It may not be as big, and certainly there's more money to be had than is landing in your pocket because of the shenanigans that we see with the way that big labels relate to the streamers. But still.
Okay. Well, thanks, Cory. This has been great. I've really got a lot from this. So,
all right.
Great stuff.
Well, thank you. Time for me to get on my next call.
Yes, for sure.
I'll talk to you later.
You're a machine.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye. Big tech monopolies are on the march, acting improperly, working for the government and sucking us in. They capitalise on me. I thought I was protected, pretty much hid, but they've got more power than the Stasi ever did. But I don't want Big Brother controlling my fate. Roll back the surveillance state. Door doesn't swing both ways, I can't see back, but I've welcomed them into my home, along with DRMs and a legal maze, so I can't even open things I own. Am I a censor or something to be sensed? The smart city's watching me and they know I'm against. I don't want Big Brother deciding my fate. Roll back the surveillance state. I've seen the sum of it, no good can come of it. Stories like these always end unhappily. Democracy dies, everyone cries behind closed doors. Then descend emphatically, but I don't want Big Brother deciding my fate. Roll back the surveillance state. In a world without scarcity, I'm doing alright. I've every necessity, every need met, enough security, except the basic right to be free. I thought I was protected, pretty much hid, but they've got more power than the Stasi ever did. But I don't want Big Brother deciding my fate. Roll back the surveillance state. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to hear the song again, just go to Spotify, Deezer, iTunes, stream it till your heart's content, or even better, because 1,000 streams buys me a cup of coffee, is to pay $1 on podsongs.com. And all that money goes to pay for the musicians, Maurizio Sanicola and Massimino Bozza, and my researcher Dori Verba, and a cup of coffee. Alright, thanks very much. See you next time.